Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon, at least Pacific Standard Daylight Saving Time afternoon. I just want to briefly welcome everyone into this Jewish Studies Zoom space here at Stanford. My name is Charlotte von Robert, and I'm the director of the Tabby Center for Jewish Studies, which assembles a wonderful group of faculty members from the various departments around Stanford, two of whom are here, along with our equally wonderful group of graduate students. I teach in the Religious Studies department in Rabbinic Literature. I'm delighted to welcome this afternoon Moriel Rothman-Zecher to Zoom Stanford Jewish Studies. He's described on various websites as an Israeli-American writer, which on a basic level means that Moriel was born in Jerusalem and lives now in the States, I believe in Ohio, who recently published his debut novel, Sadness is a White Bird, the subject of our discussion today. On his own website, Moriel is introduced as an award-winning novelist, poet, essayist, and educator. His work is charged with incredible creative energy. But I cannot stop here without mentioning that one of my favorite moments is the name of your dog, Silly Department, if that's true. Anyhow, so the novel, which is the subject of our debate today, won a number of awards, notably also the 5 Under 35 honor of the National Book Foundation, and it was a finalist of the National Jewish Book Award. I have not yet had the chance to read the novel, but I'm looking forward to being able to do so. Moriel, thank you so much for your willingness to join us for a discussion of your book, of your novel in this medium. In the before, meaning the before of the pandemic, we would have had some hors d'oeuvre to accompany the pleasures of the mind. And with some luck, we will soon get back to that. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, I would also like to acknowledge them. My dear colleagues and friends, Professor Steven Zipperstein and Professor Vera Chemtov. Steve is the one who was so taken by this novel that he initiated this conversation. Steve teaches and writes about Jewish history in Eastern Europe and is an eminent biographer. With his first, and I can only mention a few titles, but with his first biography of Achad Ha'am, and he's currently working on a biography of Philip Roth. He edits the incredibly successful, I should say, book series on Jewish lives at Yale University Press, for which the Philip Roth biography is intended. Vera Chemtov teaches Hebrew literature and Jewish literature at Stanford. She's a beloved undergraduate teacher and graduate teacher, teaches Hebrew and Jewish short story, and runs our Jewish short story contest. So is very much involved in creating new Jewish writers, who has written many essays on Hebrew poetry and a book on changing rhythm in Hebrew poetry. So I'm very delighted that both Vera and Steve are in conversation with Moriel. Before I hand it over to Steve, I also want to thank Dr. Shana Hammerman. One of my best accomplishments as a director of Jewish Studies is to hire Shana as our newly minted associate director. And so Shana made this event possible in the background and in the foreground. She's a scholar in her own right. So thank you for making the time for this event. And so with that, I would like to hand it over to Steve.
Charlotte, Shana, thank you very much. Moriel, what if we begin just with a brief reading? One of the many features of your novel that struck me from the outset was its poetic language. And of course, you work as a poet Is it fair to say that poets work? You work as a poet, as an essayist, as well as a novelist. Could you just read us just a brief section from the novel, and then we'll begin our discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you, and thank you all for having me. I'm honored to be here. So this is a brief excerpt from the first chapter of the book. The narrator, Jonathan, is addressing his friend Leif, speaking about a particular memory. Do you remember that night on the beach in Haifa when you and Nimreen tried to list for me all 26 Arabic synonyms for love? I only remember 2 of them now, aside from the basic one, al-hub, which is the root of the word habibi. Al-kalf, Nimreen said, passed the joint to me, our fingers brushing. She blew 2 pillars of smoke out of her nostrils. I told her later that night that she looked like the most elegant walrus ever to grace the coast of Palestine, and she'd laughed, wild and loud, and punched me in the shoulder. It's like exaggerated love, overstated. I looked down at the sand where Nimreen's bare feet were buried up to her ankles. On her left leg, there were 2 tiny black hairs that she'd missed while shaving, right above the shell anklet she always wore. I thought these 2 hairs might be the most beautiful thing in the entire land. Al-Jua, you said, the bass of your voice blurred by the rush of the water. Love that leaves you with a feeling of like deep sadness. You looked beautiful too, Leif. Your lanky frame origamied into compactness, knees pressed to your chest, arms wrapped around your shins. The dark threads of your scraggly beard were glistening, catching shards of hidden sunlight reflected off the moon, nearly identical to the hairs on your twin sister's ankle. I held the joint between my fingers, testing the give of the melted hash and wisps of tobacco rolled tightly into little white paper. Puff, puff, pass, Jay, you said, laughing, and I was blown away by the fact that you knew that phrase, al-kalf and al-jawwa. Of course, those are the 2 I remember now. Happy.
Moriel, thank you. I'm going to briefly explain why the first set of questions I was planning to ask you are irrelevant. I was planning to ask you about the nature of fictional autobiography, and I had planned to do so until I read earlier today an essay of yours in the Paris Review that made it clear that this indeed is not, technically speaking, fictional autobiography. And it reminded me of one of the more embarrassing episodes that I had experienced with another distinguished writer when I was in my early 20s, with Amos Oz, whose work some people have suggested, who's Michael Shali, my Michael, some people have suggested, apparently erroneously, might have inspired your use of twins in your novel. When I was in my early 20s, I was part of one of the many failed pro-peace organizations in Israel. I forget which one this was, and we had invited Amos Oz to come to Los Angeles. He was young and rather more aggressive than the Amos Oz I got to know later in his life. And in any event, he was speaking at a large synagogue in Los Angeles. I remember there being 500 or 600 or 700 people, especially because the episode I'm going to relate briefly was very embarrassing. I stood up and I explained to the audience and to Amos Oz how the book was built around his admiration for the female character, who resembled, as I saw it, a number of the women I was had dated previously, and spoke rather disparagingly of the male character in Amos Oz. And then Amos Oz turned to me and said, "You've summarized my book entirely wrong. The book was built around admiration for the male character, who apparently was modeled in some way after Yitzhak Rabin. And I've never subsequently tried to summarize another novelist's work since then, because the embarrassment was so acute. And I relate that only because and as I said a moment ago, until this morning, I thought this was largely a fictional autobiography. In as much as it's not, or if it's not, can you speak a little bit about its origins, how it came about?
Wonderful. Thank you for that story. And I think I'd like to start by gently pushing back on that version of Amos Oz and what he's recounted as saying there, because I think that on a certain level, your interpretation becomes equally valid the second the book leaves Amos Oz's desktop, right? No longer is his take on which character is meant to be lauded and which character is meant to be disparaged, the authoritative one. So I think that if this book lands in a certain way, I think it's been a gift and a sort of terrifying roller coaster at the same time to release the book and to say that actually my interpretation now is one of many. But in terms of the content of the book, in terms of the way in which it is and is not an autobiography, I'll give briefly sort of a few of my actual autobiographical elements tie directly into the book in inverse. In short, so like the main of the book, I was born in Israel, but raised mostly in America. Like the main character of the book, I dreamed of moving back to the Jewish state, to the Jewish homeland as a teenager. Like the main character of the book, I spoke fluent Hebrew and English, and also wanted to learn Arabic and curious to learn the language of the people who I never thought of as an enemy, and nor does Jonathan, the narrator here. But unlike the main character of the book, unlike Jonathan, when I was 17 and a half, I moved back to the States from my end of high school in Israel, and I deferred my military draft and went to college in Vermont at the encouragement of my parents, deciding, that I'd enlist after I finished college. And as things unfolded, and this is a story I have spoken about and written about in many other forums, I ended up returning to Israel, turning to Jerusalem when I was 22. But by that point, my politics shifted so much so that I did receive my draft notice, but decided to refuse to enlist. Spent a very short amount of time in military jail, and then was released and sort of went on my way. And so after this release, I decided that I'd like to write a book. I felt sort of a book bubbling in me. I'd written, dozens of essays and scores of poems and hundreds of millions of tweets. And I thought it was time to sort of put it together into book form, because all that felt ethereal, ephemeral, puff clouds swooping off into the ether. And so I sat down, I began writing, I began sort of compiling the stories that had happened and retelling stories that I'd already told. I found an agent who was interested in working with me. I, was probably weeks away from hitting send on a proposal of a non-fictional autobiographical retelling of sort of the events that led me to and around this decision to refuse and the time in military jail. But actually, I remember it was this moment. It was Yom Kippur. I was fasting at my in-laws' house in West Jerusalem, and I turned to my wife and said, "I don't want to write this book." And she said, "All right, why not?" And I said, "Because I'm bored. Frankly, I'm bored. Not that I think it's a story that is worth telling, but I've already told it. And I'm not interested in rehashing the story again and telling it a slightly different way and tinkering with the pieces. I know this story quite well. And if I'm bored, how dare I send a book out into the world that bores me and ask people to spend their time with it?" And so my wife, Kayla, said, "All right, so what do you want to write? Because clearly you want to write something." And so I said, I think I want to write the story of what didn't happen, but what almost did, or what didn't happen, but what easily could have. All of which is to say, it wasn't a stretch of my imagination to imagine at age 17 and a half, not deciding to go back to the United States, not deciding to delay my draft, enlisting. And of course I would have enlisted. And if I'd enlisted, of course I would have tried to get into a combat unit. And if I'd been in a combat unit, I would have almost definitely been stationed in the West Bank. And if I'd been stationed in the West Bank, what might have happened? And so that was kind of the opening premise of this novel. let's take a character who resembles me in a lot of ways and change that point in his biography. Make him not leave. And I think one of the significant differences between his life and mine, between Jonathan's and mine, is that Jonathan's grandfather is from Salonika. He is the only member of his family to survive. Everyone else is sent to Auschwitz and killed, along with the vast majority of the entire Salonican Jewish community, whereas my grandfather's family is safely in Philadelphia by that point. And this difference, which, you know, is 2 generations back, I think in a lot of ways makes all the difference in our 2 stories. That for me, there was never a choice between military service and family. And for Jonathan, that choice became the central one he had to face. So that's the sort of how the book came into being. It was started with this, what I call a counterfactual autobiography, and it you know, without getting too deep into the mystical quite yet, the book so wanted to come out of me that I think I wrote 100,000 words in something like 8 weeks, and then of course spent time making sense of those words. But the story, while not true, felt like it touched on a truth that was not based in fact per se.
Varied.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself first. It's wonderful to have you here, Moriel, and I'm very happy you decided to write and to publish the book, because I read many books that deal with a conflict through relationship with between Israelis and Palestinians. And your story is different and interesting. And I'd like, if I'll have time today, to ask you a little bit about these differences. But the first thing is to ask you about thinking through and with literature, because the story is written as a letter or as a conversation, and you include a lot of poems and references to Darwish and Amichai and others. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the role of literature and poetry, literature in general, in this book. And what is it that you discovered through writing this book? So what thinking with literature brought into the argument or the understanding of the conflict that the essays and other forms didn't?
Thank you, Vered. I love that question, and I love these 2 questions back to back, because it reminds me how, of course, I mean, and I think we all know this, all of us who read books and read literature, a book is many things at once. And so I can say, on one hand, this book is a counterfactual autobiography, and that's true in part. And on the other hand, in response to this question, this book is also a conversation with a single poem. In particular, I think I understand the book as a conversation with Mahmoud Darwish's 1967 poem, A Soldier Dreams of White Lilies, or Jundi Yahlum Bizanabiq al-Bayda. And so I first read it in a modern Arabic poetry seminar in my senior year of college with Professor Huda Fakhreddin, who's a brilliant professor of Arabic poetry and Arabic literature. And encountering this poem did something to me, to my political thinking, but also I think to my very being, that probably no work had done before. So to tell the story of the poem briefly, the story was written shortly after the 1967 war. And Darwish, in his interviews, has said that this poem was written based on conversations with a friend of his named Yossi, an Israeli Jewish friend who was a comrade in the Israeli Communist Party in Haifa and who fought in the 67 war. And this poem is unlike unlike most political poems that you read. And so I think it contrasted in my mind, in my heart, I guess, with another poem of Darwish's, another famous poem, which is called Identity Card. And that it's a well-known poem, it's a nationalist poem. It's a poem where, particularly and famously, there's a line where Darwish says, if I get angry, أَأْكَلُ لَحْمِ مُغْتَسَبِي, right? I will eat the flesh of my usurper. And that line, reading it, it's, massively disturbing, of course, but also in some ways, as an Israeli Jew, easy, right? Because it's extreme for me, and I'll speak from my experience as an Israeli and American Jew. The line is so extreme, so vicious, so intense that he wants to eat the flesh of me, of us, of seeing us only as a usurper, as an oppressor. Okay, he has his narrative, I have mine, we'll stay on our sides, things will go on as they have. But Jundi yahlam bizanabiq al-bayda, a soldier dreams of white lilies, isn't like that. The responses nationally on both sides to Darwish's poem, and may we get to live again in an era in which people are responding in anger to poems. I think we actually might be returning to an era like that, or coming to another era like that. But sort of the responses on both sides were as follows. Many Palestinians, this is according to Darwish himself, many Palestinians said to him, what are you doing humanizing Israeli soldiers, right? Because the poem is tender, it's gentle, it's strange. The soldier dreams of white lilies, an olive branch, her breasts an evening blossom. I asked him, did you feel sad? Mahmoud, my friend, he said, cutting me off. Sadness is a white bird that does not come near a battlefield. Soldiers commit a sin when they feel sad. And onwards like that for 3.5 pages. And so Palestinians asked him, what are you doing humanizing our oppressor, humanizing our usurper right after the war? And that's a discourse that I'm not involved in, essentially, right? Because I didn't need a poem for me to humanize Israeli soldiers, because Israeli soldiers were my friends and my cousins and me in an alternative universe, and my brothers and my lovers, etc. But then Israeli Jews asked Darwish, because there's a line in that poem that says, will we meet again? Maybe in a country far away from here. And so Israeli Jews asked Darwish, are you saying to us that in order to love peace, we have to leave? And that question was one that tore at me like no other. One that did not let me to.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I was really struck by your phrase, your characterization of the poem as different from most political poetry. In what respect is your novel in conversation with and different from political fiction? Is yours a political fiction? And if so, how? And if not, why not? And what political fiction has inspired you? To what extent are you in conversation with political fiction, whether in the context of is Israel situation or other situations?
That's a wonderful question. So I think in terms of the question about Darwish's poem, and I think in which I hoped to frame this book, I hope to approach this book, is to learn from Darwish's, essentially, and I do see it as an act of political fiction, even though it's a poem and we oftentimes draw these boundary lines between poetry and fiction. I think the poem is an act of political fiction. And I think this book is too, although I've gone back and forth as to whether or not it's a political book. It's not a political book in the sense that it has a point the reader ought to take away, right? It's not a political book that comes to convince you of X, Y, or Z. Certainly not to say that A, B, and C ought to happen in order to make things better.
But just to break in, I mean, neither are Conrad's novels or Dostoevsky's novels, and at the same time, both are in one way or another deeply political. But go on.
So I think yes. I think the answer on a deeper level is that it is a work of political fiction. It engages with some of the central political realities of Israel-Palestine, both histories and those taking place in sort of the present or the near present. I think the fiction, political and less, although I think that most fiction is probably political on some level, whether or not the author is aware of that. The fiction that I'm drawn to the most is that which looks at people who are fundamentally decent and are drawn into vicious conflict with one another, people who are basically or want basically to be good and yet do things that are bad and sometimes even horrific. And I think that the project here was not to win. And I think a lot of times in the discourse in Israel-Palestine, the aim is to win, right? The aim is to win. And essentially, and I'd say that Darwish's poetry card wanted to win, right? It's a blow struck for the national cause. It's a blow struck on behalf of your people. We are right and they are wrong, or we are wrong and they are right. And this book doesn't want to win. This book doesn't aim to sort of succeed in convincing the unconvinced or in striking a blow for my sort of specific political camp. But I think on a deeper level, the sort of the ethics of the book are a refusal to look away, to smooth over, refusal to sort of to simplify the situation that we collectively are enmeshed in for the sake of a win.
Very.
I like thinking of this book together with Darwish, and Darwish, for those who don't know his work, knew Hebrew really well, and also had an Israeli Jewish lover. And one of his most famous poems start with between me and Rita. He calls her Rita. Between Rita and my eyes, there is a gun, something like that. I'm kind of butchering the line, but that's the idea. And so I think that he's taking a completely different approach than yours, in the sense that he moves the story of the relationship of the love into power. It becomes something that has to do with winning and losing and power and so on. And you go away from that. You go away from this kind of masculinity too. And I wanted to ask you about that, because part of your of telling the story of Israel, of Zionism, of the conflict, and also of coming of age that is included there, is a story of thinking about masculinity. And I wonder if you can say something about that.
Thank you. I think that you're right, that in this book the relationship doesn't serve as a symbol, doesn't serve as a sort of an allegory for the conflict. The relationship is fundamentally, it's the story of Jonathan and his connection and friendship and romantic relationship with these two Palestinian twins, Laith and Nimreen, a year older than him, university students at the University of Haifa. And I think through this, Jonathan has these abilities to sort of explore his national identity, but also to explore his sexual identity. That in some ways, Jonathan as a character is defined by, or at least defines himself by, a sense of fluidness, by a sense of porousness, of borderlessness. And I think in some ways, this sense is simultaneously what makes his character, to me, such a beautiful one and such a problematic one. And I think it's problematic on the national level, where Jonathan says, I'm not going to take a side. I will, I'll be loyal to my people, loyal to my country, make my Palmachnik grandfather proud, serve in the military, wield my weapon, do as I'm told, but be sure that I'll be good. And simultaneously, I'll learn Arabic, I'll learn about Palestine, I'll memorize Mahmoud Darwish snippets to impress my friends and love interests. And I think in this sense, Jonathan embodies a dangerous naivete that I think a lot of us do, that I certainly have at some points, which is to say that he thinks that his individual intentions, his individual allegiances are enough to counterbalance the weight of history and nation pressing on him and pressing him forward, placing the gun in his hand, telling him how to act as a man, as a Jew, as an Israeli. And I think it's not a spoiler to say that illusion for Jonathan is shattered devastatingly. Simultaneously, he has this fluidity, this openness sexually, in terms of his sexual identity, which I think is quite beautiful. And it comes from a similar place in him where he doesn't want to take a side, right? He's perhaps more physically attracted to women than to men, but is also attracted to men. He is drawn to Nimreen, the sister of the two twins, in a sort of fiery, romantic way. But with Laith too, there is this sort of a deep romantic and sexual love that isn't culminated in the same way, but is present for him. And I think for Jonathan, I think that he has this open-eyedness and open-heartedness, which allows him to sort of laugh gently even at the sort of borders that are put up around masculinity, at these borders that say, a man may never kiss a man, but, the way you cuddle with your soldier buddies after you jump out of a plane, the way you stroke each other's necks when you're proud that you've done something well, the way you drape your arms over each other, the way you press your foreheads to one another, that is a different thing entirely. And I think Jonathan in this book would say, no, it's not. Come on.
So Moriel, when you speak about that term that you used just before, borderlessness, if you're also an essayist. So if you were to address Jonathan's naivete as an essayist in conversation with Jonathan, what might that conversation sound like? In speaking as you to him?
Beautiful question. So I think, and this is what was the joy of writing fiction, is that I'm not sure that my essayist voice is the correct one. The stance that I ultimately chiseled down to was basically was to say on the national level that porousness, that borderlessness is not possible. If you join the military, you are sent where you're sent. If you're sent to the South Hebron Hills and told to put down a demonstration, you put down that demonstration. If you're told to demolish a home, you demolish a home. And the individual's conscience, the individual's sort of heart, and the individual's intention ultimately doesn't matter. Jonathan, I think, would bring up in encountering my essayist self, he would say, right, because the Kufr Qasim massacre is present in a fictionalized way in this book. This is a massacre in which Israeli forces murdered 49 Palestinian citizens of Israel who were, guilty of violating a curfew that they had no way of knowing was in place. And the soldiers knew this, and it was known that this would be the result. But so Jonathan's response would be, what about the 7 other villages? Right? There were 7 other villages in the same area of Israel-Palestine that had the same curfew, and there were massacres in none of them. right? Because of the actions of individual soldiers and commanders. The commanders who said to their soldiers, shoot only on my order, and never gave the order. The commanders who shot into the air and let people run away. The commanders who said, this is an unjust order and we're not following it. So, right, there were 7 other villages in which there were not massacres. And Jonathan's argument toward Moriel, right, toward the essay itself would be, I want to be one of those 7 commanders. I want to be one of those who shoots into the air. I want to be one of those who tells my soldiers only to shoot when I shoot and never shoots. And so I think I agree with Moriel more than Jonathan, although I'm not sure. The decision I made in my life was that I think it's more likely that the individual, no matter how well-intentioned, will be subsumed by the system. But then Jonathan would push back and say, what if he wouldn't? What if he won't? Are you forsaking the chance to sort of stand in front of some evil by opting out of the mess entirely, opting out of the morass entirely? So I guess the third thing I'd add, if this book is a counterfactual autobiography and it's a conversation with Darwish, it's also an argument with myself. It's an argument with a political decision I made that I don't think takes a single stance. I don't think this book has an answer to any of these questions of must Israeli Jews leave in order to have peace, as the sort of Darwish question, soldier counteract horrors going around him, or is an individual always going to be subsumed by the sort of greater forces? I don't think there's one answer to be found in this book. I hope there are many, and I hope there are questions raised, and there still are for me as someone engaging with the characters some years later.
Fair.
So how is these questions that you ask are different because you ask them as an American Jew versus as an Israeli? So how would you answer them as Israeli versus an American Jew? I'll tell you one reason I'm asking this. When I was reading the book, and myself being both Israeli, I was born in Israel, but I lived in the United States for 30 years. And I thought about how much history plays a role in your book, in your arguments, in your thinking about these questions. And I was wondering to what extent this comes from, the perspective of American Jewish education. Well, the present is less there, right? The argument of, it doesn't matter what my parents or grandparents or whoever did. Now I'm living here. This is where I was born. I have no other place, right? So this was less of an interesting argument for you. Anyway, I can speak about it forever, but I would love to hear from you. What is this combination of Jewish Israeli for you when it comes to these questions?
Yeah, right. It's a magnificent question, I think, and we could speak on this one for a long time. I think I'll tell a story of sort of my political and ethical understanding as a way of potentially answering this. And I think that I'm not sure what I have to say about American Jew versus Israeli Jew. I feel like this question almost to me comes down to diaspora Jew versus Israeli Jew. I don't know if there's an Americanness to it per se, as much as it is a Jew away from Israel, a Jew outside of Israelness to it. But so the story that I wanted to tell was of 2 Gaza wars, right? So the Operation Cast Lead, which took place in 2008, end of 2008, beginning 2009. And I was at this point, I was in college in Vermont. And I was learning Arabic, and I was, reading Darwish, and I was, studying Edward Said and Amichai and a bunch of other minds and texts, and Kanafani, Hassan Kanafani. And the war started, and I saw it differently than my friends in Israel, even my friends who had, very similar political leanings to me. I was sort of looking at it from afar and seeing, 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 1,000, 1,500 Palestinians killed over the span of this month, and I think 10 Israelis as well. And so seeing it from this zoomed out distance, I felt in a way that I only could put into words later. I felt that in Vermont, I was much closer. Gaza was much nearer to me than when I lived in Tel Aviv during the next war. Right, Gaza was much closer to Vermont than to Tel Aviv. And that felt, and it's an absurdity geographically. Obviously, I could literally run from Tel Aviv to Gaza if I went out for a long run. And yet there was this sense in which Gaza was visible to me from Vermont in a way that it never was when I lived in Israel. And this was the case even later, when I was sort of deep in the sort of left political world in 2014. And this has to do with things that everyone knows, maybe perhaps intellectually, but are hard to translate into realities, which is to say, fear clouds your vision, right? Going into a bomb shelter makes it very hard to empathize with people in 40 kilometers away who might not even have a bomb shelter, whose entire building might have just been bombed by your jets. Feeling that your sibling is in danger when they're sent in there as a soldier makes it much harder to think about all of those siblings who are being shot at or shooting at your sibling. And so I think the way in which I see this book as fundamentally diasporic is essentially this privilege to zoom out, right? This ability to sort of step back and then step back again and then step back again and then step back again and say, right, I see this moment, house is demolition in South Hebron Hills, and I'm going to zoom back to 1929, and I'm going to zoom back to Kufr Qasim, and I'm going to zoom back to Salonika, and I'm going to zoom back to histories of persecution and of trauma and of bloodshed. And that's something that you can do when you're far away. It's much, much harder to do when you're inside a thing. And I think, and we can find examples of this in all sorts of directions. I don't think that it's only Israelis who are unable to see what's around them, or there's anything uniquely American about the ability to sort of to zoom back, to zoom out. I think that there are realities here that I are blind to due to the fact of our living within them and living around them. But I think that's probably what I'd say is the fundamental way in which this book is diasporic. Even as I wrote most of it living in Jerusalem, everyone I talked to and everyone I spoke with, for the most part, lived in Israel, Palestine. And so it's a book that's present in the land, but has this wider lens than I often even felt in myself, in my day-to-day reality in Jerusalem.
There's so many different ways in which even within Israel one could zoom in and zoom out. I was raised in Bnei Akiva. I was Rosh Chinuch Bnei Akiva in the Western States in high school, and many of the people I grew up with live on the West Bank. And when they speak about Medinat Tel Aviv, they talk about it as being distant from what they call reality. And I also admire your capacity to be able to imagine running from Tel Aviv to Gaza, the difference between a millennial and a baby boomer. But perhaps this as a last question for this exchange, and then we'll open up. I started with Amos Oz. I thought I might turn to Amos Oz again. You remember that famous analogy that he drew in justifying his understanding of Zionism, likening the creation the dilemma facing Jews to that of a man or woman on the top of a burning building and jumping off of the burning building and falling onto someone innocent. And what was the person jumping from the burning building to do? No one's at fault. I was thinking about that analogy in reading that section of yours on Salonika and Jonathan's grandfather's experience. And to what extent are you as in the novel saying something similar, different? How might you respond to Oz's analogy?
So I want to read a quick section that I think is directly to that. And this is in that chapter in which Jonathan has gone to Salonika, has gone to see his family's country, his family's city, his grandfather's home. And when he gets there, he calls Nimreen and Laith on Skype to talk about what he's seen. He has this interaction in Salonika with a hostile owner, in which the guy says to him, what you guys are doing to the Palestinians is worse than the Nazis. And Jonathan has this overswelling of rage of sort of this guy sitting here lecturing him about politics and ethics when Salonika was a killing field, and before that was was known as the Madre de Israel, right, the mother of Israel. There was a New York Times op-ed famously in the early 1900s that talked about the two-city solution to the Jewish problem, talking about Salonika and Jerusalem. And so Jonathan tells Nimreen about this interaction with the guy, and Nimreen says, "He sounds like a jerk, Jonathan, but he's partly right." Nimreen, come on. I'm just saying, maybe not the worst kind, because there's no colonialism Olympics, but Zionism is for sure colonialism. No, it's not, Nimreen, I said, breathless, each fiber of my body frozen, and it felt like there was much more at stake here than just our different interpretations of history. Jonathan, it is. Jews came to Palestine, displaced and murdered the indigenous people, Nimreen said. They turned us into refugees and took our land, closed the borders, turned Al-Birwa into Achihud and Palestine into Israel. Khalas, that's it. That's colonialism. It's not so complicated. My grandfather didn't come for cheap labor or gold, Nimreen. He was cheap labor, actually. For my grandfather, Zionism wasn't about greed or getting rich. It was about survival. Without Zionism, I probably wouldn't be alive. Okay, but think about it for us. What does it matter if it's gold or if it's, Nimreen said. The result on our backs is the Nakba, it's Kufr Qanut. Either way, it's the same, Jonathan. We can't be together, Jonathan, she didn't say. It has to matter, Nimreen. How can you not have compassion for someone seeking refuge from genocide or someone trying to save their people from extermination? How can your love for me not conquer everything, Nimreen, I didn't say. It's hard to have compassion for someone who's trying to steal your, what else were we supposed to do? Just march passively into the, we weren't the ones killing. What about Hebron 1929? People with axes, and we had fucked up things, but that's true for all the Zionization. Whole entire families, not Zionist militias, little kids, their heads smashed open, and I bet you didn't know the ANC exploded cafes in Johannesburg. We were trying to save I actually can't believe that your people, why are you blaming us for things like, I was trying to tell you about, it's actually insane. You were the one who started down the nationalist path. Nimreen froze again. And there's this dialogue, and it's almost as hard to follow in reading as when I read it out loud. And I think that part of what I was doing here, I wrote the dialogue out in essay form, essentially, where both Jonathan and Nimreen make their case, right? Jonathan makes the Amos Oz case that you made here. Nimreen makes the Mahmoud Darwish case that I mentioned in Identity Card. And then I sort of in later drafts, I said, this is fiction. This is not the forum to litigate and to come out with a winner and to have the jury decide, 1 point Israelis, 1 point Palestinians. And so instead of trying to keep it coherent and to make it so that someone would come out with the upper hand, their dialogue gets more and more scattered. They start talking over each other. Their points become less coherent, and they talked more like two people speaking to each other, two people who love each other and are hurting each other and are having a fight over Skype with a poor connection. And I think that to me feels like an essential part of this being a novel, that in the end, as much as I might want to, as much as the sort of Moriel narrator might want to litigate and might want to sort of come out with an answer and come up with a solution or a formula, the novel won't allow that, right? And the characters in the novel won't allow themselves to be used as mouthpieces for an op-ed, and instead they talk over each other and they jumble and they create this sort of pile of words. The only thing I think that can really be taken from is sort of the degree of their pain and the chasm that exists between them.
Charlotte, Shana, are there comments and questions from the participants?
Yeah, there are a few. Thank you so much. Because I have the mic now, I get to say that this is really beautiful and fascinating. There are a few questions, and I just want to remind people that if you just click the Q&A box, you can type your question or your comment and we will get to it. I'm going to ask my own question first, if that's okay. One of the things that you said was that their relationship is not an allegory, right? In your mind as the author, their relationship is not an allegory, but it feels like it, even in our conversation, that it becomes an allegory in spite of itself. And I'm wondering is there a way to write a relationship between an Israeli and a Palestinian, or we can think of it between other kinds of groups, between a white person and a Black person, right? Where we don't have, it's not burdened by, like you said, burdened by nation, burdened by identity politics, where we just get to learn about a relationship, or if that's not possible.
That's a wonderful question, Shana. I mean, I think it's a wonderful corrective, a wonderful amendment to my statement. And I think you're right. I think a more accurate way of talking about this book would be to say that the relationship is not only an allegory. But you're right. You're right. A relationship between an Israeli Jew and a Palestinian Arab cannot be utterly, I don't think can be utterly devoid of allegory, especially when it takes place there, right? Especially when it takes place in Israel-Palestine. And I think that you can see ways in which this happens in other novels, right? In Dorit Rabinyan's book, is it All the Rivers? Is that the English title?
Yeah.
There's a way in which the Israeli character and the Palestinian character, their relationship manages to sort of break free from the allegory while they're in New York. But as soon as they're back in Israel-Palestine, the allegory sort of comes crushing down around them. And I think for my characters, for Jonathan, Laith, and Nimreen, they found this island. And this island actually had a lot to do with America. They were physically in Israel-Palestine, but they found this island in which the three of them spoke English to each other. Right? Laith and Nimreen had lived in the States as teenagers. Their mother was a professor and took them there. And so they both speak English fluently and confidently. And for Jonathan, it's his essentially his native tongue. And so English and America and foreignness and otherness provides for them the space in which they can temporarily step out of the allegory, right? Temporarily, they can remove themselves from the politics around them, remove themselves from the nations that they belong to, the nations which are at odds, at war. And they can, make dumb jokes about Abraham Lincoln on the bus, and they can, laugh at each other and tease each other and smoke joints on the beach, and they can sort of skirt in and out into the allegory and back away from it, into the allegory and back away from it. And I think you're right that in a sense, this island has to collapse. It's a false island for them. And I think it's probably a false island in a lot of realities. It's hard to actually escape the sort of boundaries and the weight of nation and identity. And so for these characters, there does become of the allegorical seeps into the book when it zooms away from their actual interactions, when it zooms away from, I'm using zooms away a lot, when it distances from their actual bus rides and their actual shared joints on the beach, then the allegory does come in. And so I think you're absolutely right in pointing out that it is not allegory free. But I think the hope, and also, and this I can only speak about in terms of the sort of the pacing and the movement of the book. But the way that time is presented in the book is not linear. And I think that for me partly comes from this hope that although the allegory wants to have the final word, perhaps these moments in which they're on this island could be seen as just as real and just as true as the sort of the political allegory that ultimately does sweep Jonathan up in particular.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was, as you're describing America as a kind of neutral territory where the relationship can exist outside the political weight. If queerness also, it provides its own kind of island, or maybe it takes over as the leading allegory that removes the pressure, the burden of their national identities and replaces it with the burden of their sexual identities. I don't know, that's what was coming to my mind.
I think that's exactly right. I think that everything, they make efforts, both intentional and unintentional, to break out of the allegory, because no one wants to live in an allegory, right? No one wants to be perpetually an Israeli and a Palestinian. No one wants to be perpetually, representing a nation or speaking in the tongue of an identity. And so they make these efforts, and they're helped along by things like America, by things like queerness, by things like marijuana on the beach. All of these efforts to be people, I think, first and foremost, and not to be pawns. I think that is one of the sort of the core writhings in the center of this book. It's this desire to be a person and not a pawn, the desire to sort of exist poetically and not only politically.
That's great. All right, so from one of our attendees, she writes, I've read this book twice and will be leading discussions on it in 2 different book groups. What one point would you like my fellow readers to take away from this book? Easy.
Well, first off, thank you. It's a gift to an author that anyone reads the book at all, but also to hear that you've read the book twice is quite meaningful. I think because I like to imagine this book as having more of a circular shape than that of a line. Right? I think that a book that's a line, you start at the beginning and you end at the end, and when you're done, you know it all, and you move onward to the next. And I think hearing that this book invited you to circle back and to read it a second time, knowing the sort of the plot and the happenings is quite a gift. So I'm grateful. In terms of takeaways, I don't have anything singular. The only thing that I can say are zoomed. Gosh, wow, this is not a word I usually use. Perhaps it's the fact of doing this call on Zoom that is implanting the word Zoom in my psyche. I think that the broadest takeaway that I hope this book can offer is just how crucial it is to remember that there are multiple histories weighing on each of us at every juncture, that there are multiple versions of pain and multiple versions of truth, which while they often want to contradict one another and cancel one another out, more likely is that they actually exist at the same time, right? That all of this pain actually exists at once. All of these truths actually exist in the same sphere, which is not to say that there is no such thing as justice or as ethics, but just to hold the multiplicity of truth and the multiplicity of pain closer toward the forefront than the op-ed pages can possibly tolerate, right? The op-ed pages cannot tolerate this sort of multiplicity, and I think it is only the sphere of fiction and poetry can invite this multiplicity into our engagement with the sort of the Israel-Palestine discourse, and perhaps just discourse of politics in general.
Just Shannon, before you, I just want to press you on that point, Moriel, because arguably one of the worst features of contemporary American political culture is the notion that there's multiplicity of fact, and that he didn't win the election, that there was electoral fraud. Multiplicity of facts, in many ways, is what's plaguing this particular country as much as any other plague. How does one wrestle with the point that you've made, which is entirely justified, and the worry that I'm raising, which is entirely justified? How do you live with both?
I love that question, Steve. So I think that I should again amend.
I hate the situation I'm referring to, but go on. Yes.
I hate the situation. But I appreciate that I'm being asked to amend my statement. And I think this is the the ideal of a conversation, that you can sort of chisel toward more accuracy as we go on. I'm using truth here in its fictional sense, right? Because there are not multiple facts that are true in some instances. If someone says there was a massacre in Kufr Qasim and someone says there wasn't, one of these people is lying when it comes to the truth of facts, when it comes to the truth of history. But if someone, I think the truth that fiction is looking for, because the project of fiction is to suspend all of this, right? All of this is a lie. Everything in this book, we have this marvelous social contract in which we agree, which we say, I'm going to read a work of fiction, and I'm not going to ask the whole time, is that true? Is that real? Did that happen? Did that happen? Of course, certain close readers will see, I see a parallel here to this political event, or I see a mention of this actuality. But that's not the question we're being asked to bring into our reading of a novel. We're actually asked to suspend our questions about factual truth and perhaps spend a little more time with the truths that I think that are much harder to hold. But I think a truth that I would say here is most people in Israel, Palestine, probably most people in general, are motivated by worlds of pain and fear based on reality. And I think that's a truth that is often hard to hold, right? Because I think that in our political discourse, we often want to say, if the Palestinian cause is justified, then Israeli fear must be a fiction, right? Or to say, if I resonate with the Israeli side and with the Israeli story, then Palestinian pain must be just a political tool, must be a manipulation. And I think an offering that I would ask to bring forward with this book is to cast aside that nonsense and to allow for this multiplicity of pain and truth in this sense, which I do think is the real animating force behind the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I think behind much of our world.
All right, a few more comments and questions from our attendees. One person says, I heard you read for the first time at Limmud in England. So happy to hear your book is getting recognition it deserves. One of the most beautiful books I have read in the last few years. I've also read it twice. There you go. You've now had at least 4 reads of your book. Another attendee asks, has this book been translated into Hebrew, into Arabic? Might it become a source for discussion between Israelis and Palestinians?
Yeah. I think that I'm staggeringly grateful for how this book has made its way into the world. I'm grateful for the press and for the nominations and so on, and for the opportunity to read about it. The major heartbreak of mine of how this book currently exists in the world is that it has not been translated into Arabic or Hebrew. I didn't, and to be totally frank, I didn't think it was likely to be translated into Arabic, at least in the near future. It would take, for multiple reasons. I think there's very, very, very little Israeli fiction or Jewish Israeli fiction that is translated into Arabic in general. And I don't know whether there's a market for this book. I think there are some radical and sort of cutting edge Arabic presses that might be willing to do so, but there have not been any sort of overtures or sort of initial expressions of interest. With Hebrew, it's been a lot, more frustrating. And although I understand it, and there have been a number of Israeli publishers who've read the book and who've liked the book, but who said 2 things. I think this connects, Vered, to your question earlier. They said, one, the appetite for books about the occupation and about the conflict isn't great, but there are books out there and there are people who will read it and we have our audience. But the appetite for books about the occupation and books about the conflict that are viewed as coming from an outsider's perspective is basically none. Mm-hmm. And whether they're right or not, I don't know. I hope not. I hope that at some point a publisher will decide to turn this one into Hebrew and see if the audience is there. But I understand what they're saying. And I think that I partly agree with them that it's an outsider's perspective, right? I was living, I've lived almost half my life in Israel. The book is based on realities I saw and experienced and heard firsthand. But they're right that it was written originally in English and published by an American publisher. So the answer to both of those questions is no, and I hope that the answer is also not yet. That at some point there will exist a Hebrew and even an Arabic version of this book.
Well, I hope so too. Another attendee asks, Moriel, first off, thank you for sharing your work and personal story with us this evening. Would you be willing to speak about some of the ways that the identity stories and inter-ethnic relationships in Ottoman enclaves like Salonika informed the ways that you portray the identity stories and relationships in Sadness is a White Bird?
Is this question possibly from Devanar?
No.
No. So Devin may be here, and the chapter on Salonika was inspired in part by the work of Devanar, who's one of our former PhDs. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a wonderful question. I think that I don't know if I had the Ottoman Empire in mind specifically, but I have always been drawn as a sort of amateur student of history, been drawn to these political moments, these historical moments of multiculturalism, of times in which identity barriers and boundaries were more porous, and also to the times in which these broke down. I think there's probably a way in which Beirut was very present in my consciousness, sort of a more contemporary Beirut was very present in my consciousness in writing this book, just as a sort of example of a place where there was real cosmopolitanism and real fluidity in terms of ethnic and religious boundaries. And then as things started to escalate toward violent conflict in the mid-70s, these identities hardened, these divisions became much less porous. The walls grew higher and higher. And I think that in some ways, right, Jonathan, Lath, and Nimreen, they create a little Beirut for themselves, or they create a little Salonika. They create a little oasis in which your life is not predetermined by your nation, in which your allegiances are based on, what poet you love and which band you've been listening to over the past few weeks, and how well you roll a joint, and how fast you can run, and how goofy you are when you tell a pizza joke at the restaurant with new friends. So I think that there is that question. There's that longing. There's that longing for these miniature Beiruts, which exists again and again and again, and now, which exists now, right? There are miniature Beiruts everywhere, even in the current moment, even in the current realities of Israel-Palestine. And I guess maybe a tribute to these small imaginary cities, a hope that they might grow.
So moving toward a conclusion, I'm reminded of a moment in Bernard Malamud's The Assistant, when the grocer's daughter has encountered the assistant walking home from the public library, and the assistant asks her, "What book are you carrying?" And she says, "It's I believe it's Crime and Punishment." And he asks, "What is that?" And she says, "It's a novel." And the assistant says, I prefer the truth." And the daughter answers, "It is the truth." It is a real blessing to be in the presence of your book and to be in the presence of you, Moriel. Wonderful meeting you. And I hope there'll be other opportunities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. It's been such a joy and a pleasure to get to spend this afternoon with you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Berit. Thank you, Shana. Thank you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Moriel. This was really beautiful. And thank you to everyone who attended our event today. I'm going to stop the recording now.